Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a little bit of a spotlight for an older build that I don't think a lot of newer players are aware of, and if you're an older player like myself who's kind of just looking for something to shake things up, and in this case make things absurdly easy, this is the one I want to show you. Before we get into the build, be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and let me know down in the comments what builds or other guides you want to see in the future. Thank you in advance. Again, today's build revolves around doing as much damage as we basically can on Titan. And we're going to be achieving this through our Middle Tree Hammer subclass and Throwing Hammer ability, which we'll be amping up through a combination of weapons, exotic perks, and other things just to help out with the survivability and ease of use of the whole thing. Just so you know, this build is fully capable of one-phasing dungeon bosses all by yourself, and with a fire team or just prep work on your part. It's even capable of just wiping the floor with dungeon bosses, champions, high-end Nightfall content, and even potentially raids in some scenarios. Again, we are on Middle Tree Hammers, and our mods perks are more or less just there benefiting the playstyle and survivability rather than our basic damage. So if you want to rock something a little bit different than what I have, say make this a partial Warmind Cell build, or you want to make this, say, take advantage of other Charge with Light perks to benefit you in other ways, you can totally do that, and that's totally fine with me. Because of this then, we're actually going to start off on our weapons, and our weapons are actually very important, so I do ask that if you're wanting to replicate as much damage and build potential as you're seeing today, get these weapons if you can. Starting off on our weapons, our heavy weapon is Tractor Cannon. This actually applies a 1.3 times multiplier debuff onto our enemies, which is insanely crucial for ramping up our damage with our throwing hammers, and other two weapons more or less do the same. You can actually switch either of these out, and neither are required, more or less just the perks on them are required. The first is a shotgun with 1-2 punch, which essentially gives us a 3 times multiplier on our base damage for melee, and is an incredibly good perk all around. This can be found on a variety of different shotguns from a variety of different sources in the game. Essentially, just by playing, you could basically end up with one in your inventory. And the other one is the perk Headstone. I'm actually using the Vulpicula with this and combining it with the Found Verdict shotgun from Vault of Glass. The main reason rocking Headstone is to take advantage of Focusing Lens, which is a seasonal mod found on our artifact this season. I do want to point out though that Headstone is more or less just a cherry on top, so if you aren't able to actually get this for whatever reason, don't worry about it. You're still dealing insane damage, and this is very situational and when it actually does work, but it's just something nice to have in the back pocket, if you will. Before we actually get into how much damage we're dealing, we're quickly going to go over the mods just to showcase how it actually helps us with this build, as again, none of our mods are actually benefiting our damage as a whole, but we're more or less just getting increased benefits for survivability and ease of use. Starting off on our helmet, our first mod is Protective Light. Essentially, while you're charged with light, you gain a 50% damage resistance when your shields are down against combatants in PvE. This is absolutely insane, and in terms of survivability, this is about as good as it gets. There really isn't any significant need for additional Charge with Light stack investment, say as getting 4 or even 5 stacks of Charge with Light, as 2 is typically more than enough to do it, and oftentimes I found with this build that before Protective Light actually goes down, I'm able to get 2 more additional stacks to actually use in case I still need it by the time that this duration actually ends. I'm also using Shotgun Ammo Finder because realistically it benefits both our 1-2 punch shotgun and our Tractor Cannon, so why not use it? Onto our gauntlets. I'll get into more or less which one is better for which scenarios, but it's either going to be Synthoceps or Wormgod Caress. Either way, I definitely recommend having Elemental Time Dilation. Essentially, any Elemental Well mods that you actually use have an increased duration of effect. For us, it's going to be Well of Life, which has a 10-second base duration. With Elemental Time Dilation, that actually gains 3 seconds going up to 13. This might not really seem like a big deal, but in higher end content where simply a thrall mailing you can spell the difference between a flawless run and starting over, something like this is extremely noticeable for those few seconds. I want to point out this works with only well mods, so stuff like your intrinsically stacking Roaring Flames perk is not affected by this, Protective Light is not affected by this, only other well-based mods. As far as other mods that you can use on your gauntlets, really it's up to you. If you have certain champions that you want to target with your hand cannon, you can totally do that. Next up onto our chest piece, we have Elemental Charge. Essentially picking up a Solar Well will give us 2 stacks of Charge with Light. Again, we're going to be getting a lot of Solar Wells with this build, so realistically we don't have to worry about running out of any wells or getting stacks of Charge with Light. It'll be very simple, and this mod is what does it all for us. As far as other mods, I would definitely recommend any kind of concussive dampener, sniper resistance, melee resistance, or elemental base resistance mod based on whatever activity you're doing. This is the set that I'm actually using to solo Flawless Dungeon, so because of that I'm rocking a Void Resist to take care of the Ogre, as well as a concussive dampener. Next up onto our legs, we have Well of Life. Essentially picking up a Solar Elemental Well grants increased regeneration for a short period of time. Now I know what some of you are saying, we already have intrinsic healing found on our subclass with Middle Tree Hammers in Tireless Warrior, where after we hit an enemy and picking up our hammer, we have a bit of health regeneration procced. The main reason we're using Well of Life is that Tireless Warrior actually stops working whenever you take damage. So even if you did pick up your hammer, if you immediately take a small bit of chip damage, it immediately stops health regeneration and you're back to square one. Essentially what happens with Well of Life is we have 10 seconds of constant healing. There's no stopping and starting if we take damage. For those 10 seconds, we have a, albeit small, but constant increase to our health. And with Elemental Time Dilation, this turns up to 13 seconds. And whenever we have a stack of Roaring Flames that only needs procced every 20 seconds, these effectively work hand in hand, and we're not having to constantly go after melees to keep either of these up. And typically just simply getting a melee kill every 10 seconds can not only keep that insanely good buff that Roaring Flames times 3 is, but consistently give you a healing effect through Well of Life. Our final mod, which is found on our mark, is Melee Wellmaker. Again, getting melee kills with your abilities will spawn a well matching your subclass type. For our case, it's going to be a Solar Well, which then affects all of the other mods we discussed previously. As far as what's left, they're personal recommendations, but I definitely recommend Focusing Lens. Your light abilities do bonus damage to combatants affected by stasis. This is a seasonal mod and will most likely go away at the end of the season, although there is a chance it'll make a reappearance next season or in future seasons. But for right now, this is absolutely incredible, and it's something we can take advantage of on this class, even in solo play. And then finally, I'm also using Thermoclastic Strike, just in case I have any overload champions. Our melee ability can simply stagger them in one hit. In addition, we basically always have the damage up to actually one-shot these after we stagger these champions, so this essentially turns overload champions into a thing of the past. Before we start getting into the end game and my opinions on the build though, I do want to take some time to actually show you the damage values, talk about which exotic to use in which scenario, as well as my overall thoughts on the potency of this build as a whole. On screen is going to be damage tables featuring both base with Synthoceps and with Wormgod Caress, and I'm going to be talking about how each actually works intrinsically with one another. Background gameplay is more or less either me testing or using this build in solo dungeon attempts. So without further ado, getting in some basic numbers. As a start and as a general note, the damage value you are seeing is just for my recording purpose. The actual damage value indicated as our base, which is 14,301 damage here, is not going to match up with yours, especially whenever you consider what activities you're in. This was taken from a Lost Sector on Nessus. If you go into a Master Level Nightfall and have your base damage compare, it is not going to be the same. What is going to carry over and stay constant is the multipliers from our base damage based on what you use. So please don't expect to have the exact same damage value that you're seeing here. It's more or less to showcase the actual increase from our base, as multipliers can be a bit hard to understand whenever we're getting into the plus 50 times damage. You'll see that in a second. Starting off with our basic components though of just our weapons, as well as Focusing Lens through our Headstone Stasis weapon. With Roaring Flames times 3 fully active, it is a 2.2 times multiplier. As a general note, you will be seeing anytime we have a stacking perk with something like this, and as well with Wormgod Caress, we're assuming the maximum stacks with all of these damages, just because it's a bit redundant to take into account the 1, 2, 3, and even 4 times stacks whenever we're not hitting maximum damage with those. So with 3 times stacks, we're getting a 2.2 times multiplier to our base damage. We combine this with something like 1-2 punch shotgun, which is a 3 times multiplier. We get around 6.6 times base melee damage, which is already insanely good and very easy to proc when you consider that you basically walk up to whatever you want to kill, shoot it once with a shotgun, use your melee ability, and most things in the game, especially in just core playlist activities that aren't insanely difficult, it'll basically kill them entirely. Whenever we combine this with Tractor Cannon, which is a 1.3 times debuff, we're dealing on average 8.5 times our melee damage from base, which is, again, very, very good and nothing to scoff at. And we're nowhere close to being done, because if you recall with this, we're not even using an exotic yet. On top of this, we can rock Focusing Lens if we do have Headstone proc and apply stasis effects, dealing over 10 times our base damage, again, without an exotic, and exotics just make this even better. So let's take a look at the first exotic we're going to use today, which is Synthoceps. Basic premise, Synthoceps will give you the perk Biotic Enhancement when you're surrounded by 3 or more enemies within 15 meters. Which is extremely easy because there's no duration you have to worry about. There's no perk you have to proc manually. You more or less just run near enemies and it procs itself. And especially in dungeons or boss fights where there's a lot of ads all over you, you can pretty much have this constantly without worrying for a refresh or needing to keep a buff going or fulfilling some kind of mechanic to keep the buff going. You simply just have double damage when you're using this. Again, the entirety of the actual damage table is on screen for you if you want a more detailed look. But in the end, if we take our Roaring Flames times 3 with 1-2 punch, with Tractor Cannon, and with Biotic Enhancements, and combining that with Focusing Lens, we're still getting a 21 times base multiplier from our base melee damage, which is absolutely insane. Again, if you can't get focusing lens to proc, it's still 17 times damage, which is still incredibly good. But again, best case scenario, we're dealing almost 22 times damage with biotic enhancements. And again, with Synthoceps on, there's no perk you need to reproc, there's no duration you need to worry about outside of Roaring Flames. It's incredibly useful just because you simply have it and basically get double damage for free. Now, moving on to the king of middle tree DPS, it's Wormgod Caress. For those of you that might know, Wormgod actually took a bit of a nerf recently when its potency with middle tree hammers was cut down by 30% just because it was dealing literally millions and millions of DPS in the game. This was their way of kind of reining it back a little bit, although it's still incredibly strong. Essentially, we're going to consider everything shown on screen at a 5 times Burning Fist stack, just assume the absolute best, because testing for each one of these scenarios at 5 different tiers of Burning Fist with Wormgod would have been absolutely mind-numbingly long and not too useful. As a whole, at times 5, we're getting approximately 5.25 times our damage, whatever it was beforehand. Looking at the absolute best case scenario, where we have Roaring Flames times 3, a 1-2 punch shotgun, tractor cannon, as well as a 5 times stack of Burning Fist with focusing lens, our melee is hitting for 56 times the base damage. To really put in perspective how much this actually affects our damage, remember our base damage was 14,301, and with all of these perfectly considered, we're hitting a maximum damage of 804,130 damage, which is absolutely insane to think about, especially when it's coming from one melee. And with this whole setup, we can immediately do that again afterwards. Depending on the activity you're in and how many mods you can actually stack with this, as we're not even technically done there, but in terms of solo play, this is really as good as it gets. We're literally talking about millions upon millions of DPS, and it's absolutely insane the thought of how well this build does in solo play, and with the support of a fire team, just how deadly this build can really become. In my opinion, I said that certain builds are broken or certain builds are really good, but in truth, this is the most broken build in the entire game, rivaling times where Arc Striders could utilize SLAYER's Handshake and Combination Blow, killing raid bosses. We're essentially doing the exact same thing, just with a bit more setup, but again, even with something like biotic enhancements, you really just play the game using your subclass. There's nothing else to it. Wormgod's 5-second timer, though, is its biggest hit. You do need to keep a 5-second timer going, meaning your damage window for a boss or high HP target is really narrow and requires a lot of setup. So with that in mind, which do you use? Do you use Synthoceps for biotic enhancement, or do you use Wormgod for Burning Fist? In my opinion, it's Synthoceps basically every single time. Again, there's no duration or cooldown that you have to worry about. You simply wear the exotic and basically get double damage anytime you're playing the game. Again, Wormgod Caress is doing undeniably way more damage than Synthoceps, but it really limits your potential whenever you're constantly having to worry about a buff that lasts for 5 seconds, when Roaring Flames, which is a really big component of something like this, lasts for almost 20 seconds as a whole, and every other buff or debuff you're actually applying to a target is based on your input and not some kind of buff you have to constantly keep going. So with that being said, Wormgod's commitment is insanely high, and if you're in an insanely high ad density activity where you can afford to actually keep that 5 seconds going and continually proc it, it is technically worth it to do. However, I can really only count areas where that's actually worth it on one hand. So as a whole, I definitely recommend biotic enhancements, but if you find yourself in an area where you can keep that buff going well into boss phase, and preferably refresh it during boss phase, something like Wormgod Caress cannot be beat. With that being said, my final vote goes to biotic enhancements on Synthoceps. But that's pretty much it for the build today, guys. Like I said, something like Headstone combined with 1-2 punch, tractor cannon, as well as Roaring Flames, focusing lens, and any other potential mods we might see in the future for our seasonal artifact that boost our solar damage through various means. This build is the most broken build in the entire game. Literally hitting millions of DPS, outclassing and outpacing basically every other DPS option in the game, specifically for solo play. This is it. I mean, simply look up Middle Tree Titan on YouTube and you'll basically find people melting raid bosses like it's nothing. This is incredibly potent, and this is my go-to for any kind of solo activity, specifically with Grasp of Avarice, because it turns the Ogre boss into something I can do in just a few minutes and easily one-face him with something like this. Again, the biggest downside of this entire build is that you do have to be right in the face of whatever you're hitting, just to make sure you can constantly pick up your hammer and throw as fast as you can. And also, if you lose your hammer, you basically have 0 DPS, as not only can you not use the Roaring Flame stacks you actually acquired, but your base damage, unless you have something like Worm God, really isn't going to be too great, especially when compared to your Throwing Hammer base damage with everything considered. But with that being said, it's a nice trade-off whenever you're dealing literally millions of DPS and essentially turning any encounter into a cakewalk. But that's pretty much it for today, guys. Let me know what you thought of the video down below. I know that this build has been in the game for quite some time, but I was waiting until it had a proper place and I could really give it some love and explore this interaction a little bit further, and with the recent change to Worm God Caress, I figured there was no better time than right now. Let me know what you thought of the build down below, as well as any recommendations for future videos. I greatly appreciate the support on this channel and previous build guides like this. I'm really looking forward to bringing up more guides and other content news in upcoming months, and especially as we go towards Witch Queen, which I am incredibly excited about, and I can't wait to bring you more content in that season too. But thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch you in the next one.